Thank you very much for the introduction. So my name is Oisin from the University of Edinburgh, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invite to get this opportunity to talk about some of the work we've been doing. So the focus today of my talk is really to try and tell you a bit about some of the work we've been doing in the context of modeling the spatial distributions of species all around the world. And really this is the motivating question. So where are different species distributed globally? And I won't spend a lot of time motivating today why that's an important question, but you can imagine there's many reasons why we actually do want to know where species are distributed, because it can do things like inform conservation priorities. We have limited time and resources to tackle some of these dramatic declines we're seeing in the abundances of different species. And so if we know, for example, where they are, we can prioritize kind of interventions towards specific hotspots and regions where we could maybe have the most impact. And so, you know, most of what we've heard, I guess, there's always a tinge of bad news to a lot of the talks from the last day or so. But one maybe positive piece of information is that we are seeing this kind of impressive and amazing growth in biodiversity data being shared by people. And actually, a really cool part of this is one of the major sources of this is actually regular members of the public who are really engaged in going out and monitoring different forms of life and sharing this information online. So we have a bunch of these different participatory science platforms like iNaturalist, eBird, PlantNet, and so on, where people share this type of data. And so, for example, this is GBIF, which is kind of an aggregator of all these different data sets. And at the start of this year, GBIF crossed this 3 billion threshold or landmark, if you want to call it, where this is 3 billion different pieces of information related to the occurrences of different species around the world. Yeah, and so one such platform is iNaturalist. They happen to be a group that we work with, and maybe some of you have heard of it. I know someone I was talking to yesterday even uses it. And so iNaturalist has on the order of 300 million observations. So an observation is a location in time and space, and it's a photograph, which is a kind of a key thing, a key point, I think, to this type of data. We get not just the occurrence information, we also get this rich extra signal and metadata. But what's quite impressive about a platform like iNaturalist, it has data for over 500,000 species that have been collected by nearly 4 million different people all around the world. Okay, and just to kind of give you a glimpse maybe of the kind of visual diversity. So my background is kind of computer vision, and when we started working with these guys, it was so cool to see the kind of data they shared compared to the kind of boring MNIST digits and thing we worked with in the past. So there really is kind of all forms of life, from, you know, the smallest creatures, we've got plants, trees, we've got mammals, etc. Okay, and so that is kind of like the positive piece of the story. We have this data, it's being shared, it's being made available, but going back to our original question, you know, do we have a sense or a handle on where species actually are distributed globally? It turns out the answer is not really. So on the about 2 million species that have been described by science, only about 100,000 of those have actually been mapped to any kind of degree of reliability. So that's not even taking into account then the huge number of species that are yet to even be kind of described and discovered. So there's a huge kind of gap here in our knowledge of where these things are. And to give you a bit of flavor maybe of what the task we're trying to solve is, we've got some sparse observations. So these are observations in Africa for this banded mongoose. So red dots indicate areas where the species has been observed. And what we want to do is, or in the context of the talk today, is we want to be able to say something about the places or the locations where the species is likely to be actually found. So you can kind of, if I flick between the two of them, you can kind of see there's this disconnect, because we have obviously partial data, we have the sparse data, we have this biased data, and the thing we want to get here is kind of going to be impacted by the quality of data we have. And I should say here, so this particular range map, this comes from IUCN, so this is kind of like an expert derived range map that comes from not just observations obviously on these platforms, but other kind of national scale monitoring efforts and lots of kind of expertise and knowledge related to where different species might be. Okay, so what are some of the challenges? Some of the challenges are the types of data that we have readily available and globally distributed are heavily biased. So if we look at maybe, for example, some of the, a map here of estimated terrestrial mammal richness, you can see that there's a big kind of contrast to the places where actual citizen science data is collected. So here on the right, this is data from iNaturalist. We have this kind of global north bias. and it completely is uncorrelated with the kind of richness that we observe. Another big bias is this taxonomic bias. So some things just inherently are much harder and much rarer to observe than others. So for example, if we kind of count species based on the number of observations, most species fall into this bin where we have very few observations for them, and only a small percentage are things like mallards where we have these too many observations maybe. Okay. So to get into how we actually turn these sparse observations into these more detailed ranges or distributions, before I get there, I guess I could just kind of cover briefly some of the kind of main themes in this area in terms of the related work. Obviously, there's an amazing rich history here, and I won't be able to do it justice. But I think what's kind of interesting, maybe for myself, coming from a machine learning background, is that some of the earlier work in this space actually comes from machine learning itself. So models like MaxEnt actually first appeared in a machine learning venue, but then there's obviously been a huge literature on this topic, and we kind of go beyond just these simple statistical models into some more kind of complex hierarchical Bayesian models that try to encode more information about processes, interactions, and so into the models. Of late, we've seen this innovation in these kind of joint models. So we're trying to not just capture or model species individually, but we're trying to represent something about how they may interact with each other. Okay, and so in a bit of a caricature, if we thought of like a classical species distribution model, our inputs are going to be some location information related to where that species is found. So for example, a bunch of latitude, longitude observations. And then we've got some potentially other metadata or other covariates that we could use, like information related to the local climate or characterizing the local landscape where those observations are. And then the thing we want to get out of it is some kind of prediction. And in the context of the talk today, the thing we care about is just some kind of probability of whether the species is likely to be present or not at a location. So obviously there's other quantities you might want to predict, like the abundance and so on, but that's out of scope for today. So in my group, and actually there's many others who are also kind of interested in this topic, we've been working on what we call like deep species distribution models. So they differentiate themselves, I think, from the classic forms in a few ways. So one is that we're modeling inherently many species at once. So unlike maybe classical joint models that look at maybe kind of tens or at most even hundreds of species, we're going to be modeling tens of thousands of species inside of the same model. And we're going to be able to then predict ranges for tens of thousands of species. And a kind of a crucial benefit of this is this ability to kind of capture these interdependencies, these relationships between species. But the other big piece of, or big enabling capability of these models is the ability to incorporate other information. So metadata, yes, like environmental information, but we can also do things like incorporate natural language descriptions, we can incorporate images and so on into these models to learn better representations and to make better predictions. Yeah, so to kind of give you a bit of a kind of a high-level overview of what the structure of these models look like, I'll show you this kind of toy example. So in this toy example, we've got longitude and latitude, and we've got 3 species. So we've got green, blue, and red, and the dots indicate locations where they're found. So the models that we're going to learn, they're kind of really consist of 2 main components. So one is a location encoder. So this is some kind of transformation of a location. So literally a latitude and longitude, transforming that into some latent representation or a location embedding. So you could just think of this as a location goes into the model and a vector comes out of it. And then for each species, we're going to learn a species encoding. So this is basically going to be, again, some kind of representation of that species, another vector. And then the key idea, very simple, is if we multiply a location encoding with the species encoding, we want to have a high value or a high probability for a location where the species actually be present in the training set, and then we want a low value where it's not present. Okay, and so you can imagine then if I took this model once it's trained, I ran it everywhere on the in my domain of interest, I'll get some kind of high green value here for the green species and high blue for that, and red, and obviously they can overlap, but effectively we're producing a different distribution for each of the individual species. Okay, and so I won't get into it today, but there's some kind of technical challenges related to doing this, because what we'd love to have is this kind of rich presence-absence information. So we'd love to have observations of where something is deemed to be present and information about where it's not. in practice, it's much harder to confirm the absence of something than it is to record the presence of it. So what we typically have in these settings is just this presence-only data. Okay, so we had a paper around 2 years ago or so where we introduced this kind of framework and kind of showed how we could train these models at scale. And in the context of that work, we were training these models on around 50,000 species with about 35 million or so observations. And I think what's kind of nice actually about all of this is it turns out this ends up being a really compact model. So this is a model that's only, in terms of like the number of parameters, it only ends up being about 100 megabytes. And I won't talk about it too much today, but there's a kind of an enabling use case that allows, which is you can now go then with your phone out into the wild when you have no signal or no internet connection, and you can use this model to give you some kind of prior about what species you might expect to find at those locations. Okay, so yes, we now can use this model to predict the distributions of species, or I guess at least the occurrence. And so we'll just flick through some of these examples just to give you a sense of the kind of geographic distribution, but I guess also maybe the kind of spatial scale, which is not highly detailed, but it's slightly more spatially coarse. And so we can see here down in New Zealand and North America. Okay, but I think for me what's actually more interesting and more fun perhaps is to get a bit more of an insight into what these models are actually learning. Okay, so if you recall a few minutes ago I talked about the fact that the model is two separate components, a location encoding and a species encoding. So we can actually interrogate the location encoding to see what type of representation of space it's learned. Okay, so basically what I'm doing here is I've taken this location encoder, I've run it on every location on Earth, and I've extracted out the vector that it has, and then I can just visualize that vector in 3 dimensions, okay? And so it turns out if we train the model with a very tiny amount of data, we see some kind of broad geographic regions being separated from the model, so at the very least it kind of knows that there's some kind of different encoding required for North America versus South America and so on, but nothing perhaps too interesting to say about this. If we add a lot more, so now I'm going to show you another result where we add much more data to the model when we train it. What we see here is that this kind of interesting spatial structures emerge. So for example, we can see maybe something that looks like the Sierras here in California, we see mountain ranges in South America and so on. So this is just emerging from the model without it getting any kind of explicit information about altitude or environmental conditions. It's just having to figure out how do I encode this location such that the predictions I make support the types of species that should be there. So this is a kind of an emerging property of the model that's just forced to try and represent these tens of thousands of species that it's trained on. And in the same way we can interrogate the representation of space, we can also interrogate the representation of species. So if you recall, I said there was a vector for each species. So you could think of it, this is like in practice 50,000 species. I'm just visualizing them in 2D here using TSNE. So for example, species, this red species could be here, this green one could be here, and blue and so on. But in practice what it means is a given species exists somewhere in this species encoding space, and that then manifests as a kind of a range prediction or distribution for that species. And so what I'll do now is I'll show you an animation where we're walking around this space of species, and you can kind of, hopefully you can see, I know it's confusing, I have 2 red dots, but hopefully you can see this other red dot. And as we move around, when the dot doesn't move too far from its previous position, you end up seeing very similar distributions here on the right. But when it makes a big jump, for example, now it's just jumped into New Zealand, you can kind of see that it represents different geographic regions. So effectively what we're seeing here is just for the model to be able to explain the regions of many species, basically it can leverage the fact that there is a lot of potential similarity to be found in there. And so it organizes or it finds an encoding of species such that ones with similar ranges end up being encoded in similar positions in this embedding space. Okay, and so a big part of our work was actually to come up with some kind of repeatable and reliable benchmark such that we can actually quantify performance on this task. You know, the reality is that we are more on the methods development side. We're not kind of domain experts, and we don't have that expertise to be able to qualitatively look at these maps and say whether they're good or not. And we also want to kind of drive progress in this field from the machine learning community. And so a big part of our work was actually coming up with ways to quantify this to this task more reliably. And so in practice, what does this look like? It means we kind of curating this expert benchmark of let's say, relatively spatial coarse but globally distributed expert range maps, and then we can compare the predictions from models against these maps. Okay, and so we can measure that. So here we're measuring the performance as mean average precision. And so what I'm going to show you here is, again, this type of result where I'm going to change the amount of training data the model has seen to give you a kind of an impression of how the model responds as more data is provided to it. So when we give the model a relatively small amount of data, this is data from my naturalist starting from before 2010, you can see the performance here on the two different benchmarks we have. So these are two different sets of species, basically. And as we add more data to this model, we see this nice property that's, that is reassuring to see, that we see kind of better performance as we add more training. So the model is learning better representations of locations, better representations of species. Yeah, so this was deployed then on iNaturalist 2 years ago at this point. And one actually the primary use cases is not necessarily to generate these kinds of maps. I think we're still a bit away from getting really high quality, reliable maps. But actually it's to support image classification. So if you've used some of these platforms, you might know that actually now you can upload assets like images and they'll automatically classify or they'll attempt to classify the species present in them. And so for example, iNaturalist now has computer vision models that can classify about 100,000 different species. But obviously, if you know where someone is taking that photograph, that's a huge piece of extra additional information that you could utilize to improve your classification performance. So it's not just the image, now it's the image and the location. So we can take the models that we've just talked about and use that as a kind of a spatial prior on the prediction. So we combine the probabilistic predictions from the vision model with the probabilistic predictions from the models I just talked about, and we can see this quite big improvement in terms of performance. And I think to put this in context, we often think about performance improvements in the orders of kind of percents or 0.5% in the context of computer vision, because here this is 100,000 way classification. So random chance is a very tiny number, but we're seeing nearly something like a 10% top one improvement, which is combining the two different models. Yeah, and so you can do things like anomaly detection, find things that are outside of their ranges. And then recently, iNaturalist put out this open range map data set. So this is something I think we want to kind of improve over time and make better. Okay, so that was really kind of like the basic model. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about these other, I think, capabilities that are now possible because of the structure of these types of models. So one of these big abilities is this capability to integrate additional metadata. Okay, so you could think of this as like, the question really is like, how can we use alternative information to learn better representations for our species encoding? So if I had some other information, how would I be able to utilize that to input into our model such that we get a better encoding here? And one obvious piece of, or maybe it's not obvious, but one potential source of signal is the fact that for many species, there actually exists pretty rich text descriptions describing their range or habitat preferences. So, this is quite distinct from your classic kind of spatial observations where we have lat-long information. Instead, we have this kind of qualitative information indicating, okay, this species likes this type of scrubland in this particular part of the world. But you can see how, like, in this setting where we have very few observations for something, this kind of qualitative information actually is a pretty strong signal if we could come up with some way to actually encode that and put that into our models. And it turns out there's a relatively simple way to do that. So we can take large language models, frozen language models, specifically text encoding models, put that text into the model and just make sure we train this whole thing jointly. So effectively, we've got snippets of text related to these species. We encode this through some kind of language encoder, so we get a vectorized representation of text. So we're not doing any kind of specific parsing of the text to extract out like place names or anything like that. We're just putting the raw text into the models. And effectively, that is operating as a surrogate for this kind of species embedding. So we're basically learning the transformation of raw text to an encoding of a species. And so in the context of some of these experiments we've been doing, we've been using text from Wikipedia articles, but you can imagine using other sources like the academic literature and so on. Yeah, so the cool thing about this now is we can actually take raw pieces of text, like this text here, input it into the model, and then we can see the model's prediction when it gets this kind of information. and this is the kind of this is a species not seen in the training set, and this is the kind of expert range map for that one. But what's kind of fun about this is that what's basically emergent from this is this ability to kind of geolocalize language in a zero-shot mechanism. So we can take things like the word India, we can put that through the language encoder, use our location encoder and find the locations that have a high affinity for the word India. And so you can see here the model, India is here, it's kind of interesting. Tropical rainforest, you can see this here, Great Lakes and so on. So these are not like species concepts, this is text that is likely to be kind of in descriptions of species, and the model has actually figured out how to encode that. This is not that useful, but you can do things like geolocate concepts that are totally out of distribution for species, like this is where the model thinks pasta is, or political leaders from South America, or Hello Kitty here in Japan. So this is this kind of cool, like I guess, ability for the model to kind of structure information and find these connections because it's effectively encoded inside of the weights of the large language model we use. Yeah, and then importantly, this is not just because we want to know where pasta is. We can actually we can use that information to improve our predictions for species ranges. So this is the kind of model I presented earlier on today, just the basic one. When we use that text information, we can actually enhance the representation as we learn and get better predictions. Yeah, and then the same thing, I won't talk about it today, but the same thing applies for images. You can imagine images provide a lot of context because perhaps the background of the image gives you some signal about the habitat and so on. But even these models, when we train them images, we can take things like, to some extent, I mean, this is not a relatively limited capability, but we can do things like take images of, scenes, and we can see where the model thinks that such a thing would be located. Yeah, and so the kind of, I guess, like the opportunities from this is then to think about ways of combining these modalities. So, for example, maybe I've got one observation in the extreme of a particular species. So this is the observation. The model can still make some prediction from that observation, but I could also do things like condition the model based on text I also have, or maybe some kind of description of the habitat. So we can see here the same observation when combined with different pieces of text like high altitude mountains or deserts gives you radically different predictions. So the kind of drive here, I suppose, is to give people more control over the predictions of these models in settings where they have very limited in situ observations. Yeah, and a big kind of driver, I think, of the work we're doing at the moment is to kind of address what is basically one of the fundamental challenges in this area, is that we have very few observations for most species. So I talked about this platform iNaturalist, 500,000 species. In practice, is a really long tail because most things are not well represented and a small number of things are heavily represented. So, how do we end up making plausible range predictions in cases where we have like 3 observations for those species? And again, I won't talk about it in detail today, but what we've been trying to do is target our evaluation and the models we develop at this particular low data regime. So for example, here on the bottom, on the x-axis, we're varying the number of observations we give the model for a whole set of species. And then on the y-axis, we measure the performance of the model. And some of the latest work we've been doing, we're seeing kind of like non-trivial performance boosts based over the kind of simple model that I presented at the very start. So really the question is like, how far can we push the model performance in this kind of highly impoverished low data regime? Yeah, okay, so I just want to wrap up with maybe some open challenges, and I think for many people that are familiar with this topic, these will not necessarily be too surprising. So one of the big ones is the data challenges, some of these spatial, temporal, and taxonomic biases that exist inside of these data sets. To some extent, this is something that will partially get alleviated as these platforms hopefully grow and expand, but I think that some of these geographic biases are always going to be fundamentally an issue, and that's going to need a lot more kind of, insight from statistics and statistical ecology as well. And you can kind of see here, so this is, for example, a visualization of the errors of one of our models, where brighter color means more error, and so we're seeing that we're getting these big errors in kind of regions that are not necessarily very well represented by our model. Another huge question is valuation. So, our models, in practice, they have no explicit spatial resolution. It's an implicit encoding of spatial resolution. But the limiting factor we have is when we evaluate these models, we have these relatively coarse spatial maps. And so what we'd love to have is a kind of a much richer set of data that we can actually use to target evaluation both globally but also hyperlocally as well. And so I think that's something that would be great to see kind of more activity maybe from experts in the community to try and build these benchmarks so that we can push the limits of these models. Yeah, another thing I think would be cool is to have kind of beyond just like the range of a species, but to have kind of a more fine-grained description of the range. So this is an image from eBird Status and Trends, who do this amazing work on modeling spatial distributions of birds. And you can see that we're not just encoding where the bird is, but we're giving you some information about maybe something about like its activity at different times of years, and which is encoded via color here in this map. And yeah, the last one, which is a bit of an issue, I suppose, is like this whole problem that you could end up reinforcing errors inside of these data sets. So yes, I could go to a zoo in Vienna and I could take a picture of a panda, and my vision model tells me it's a panda, and I upload it to one of these platforms, and now all of a sudden my GeoPrior, my species distribution model, starts seeing pandas in Vienna and starts adding it in. So there is still this need for this human curation step, and thankfully these platforms are not moving towards a fully automated workflow. In practice, platforms like iNaturalist have this human verification step where people actually look at the images, they decide whether the IDs are sensible or not, and they have to reach some consensus. Yeah, so in summary, I showed you that we can train a single model to jointly estimate the range of tens of thousands of globally distributed species. More data helps. We ended up getting better predictions. Also, this kind of multi-modal signal that is readily available online can be used, and again improves our performance, but there's still many challenges left to solve. Yeah, big thanks to my collaborators. There's a joint work with a whole bunch of people, mainly led by Christian Lang and Eli Cole, but there's a whole bunch of others that did a lot of great work here to help us do this. The references are here, but again, you can go to my website. I'll have a link at the end in case you want to grab any of the papers, or obviously come find me and ask me questions. I'd love to talk more about this stuff. Yeah, so I guess we're not doing questions now, but thank you very much for your attention.